Got to take a look at these Trump appointments. Professor Marc Genest will evaluate.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
We're lucky in Rhode Island here to have some really smart go-to people on the issues of state, and insurgency and terrorism. And those are two categories that Professor Marc Genest focuses on the Naval War College. His opinions are his own, but his analysis is key to, us relaxing, or maybe not. I'm not sure. I never know what he's going to say, but we'll check in with him momentarily here. How you doing? Thanksgiving week, lots going on. Donald Trump moving ahead, tweeting, deciding, tweeting, deciding, tweeting, 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 deciding, blah, 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 right? Let's go to the rundown and talk about what's happening. First, on a local level, first they were lost and they were found, then they were found. The ballots, and it's really not that big a deal. It's not a lot of high drama. The headline here from the Providence Journal, in recount, 208 votes lost and then found with the District 15, Nick Mattiello, Steve Frias race. Of course, Nick Mattiello, the Speaker of the House. That's where they do all the recounting in the Board of Elections. It turns out that they misplaced an envelope at the Cranston Board of Canvassers. It's not that big a deal. They found it. But it doesn't bring a lot of confidence to the table in terms of the sovereignty and validity of the elections. I am sure that it's all legitimate and all good, but these kinds of little miscellaneous mistakes cannot be handled nonchalantly by the Board of Elections, and there ought to be some kind of disciplinary price to pay for those who just even burped with the ballots. Having said that, the recount moves to the advantage of the Speaker of the House. 84 votes now separate him and his standout challenger, Steve Frias. And you'd think that'll be the end of it, and next week they'll certify the vote. But Mr. Frias and his GOP chairman, Brandon Bell, are pursuing fraud charges, or at least asking for fraud investigation. The Rhode Island State Police has acknowledged that they're looking into a one-incident situation where a gentleman says, more or less, my words, that he was coerced or observed too closely filling out a ballot for actually Steve Frias when it was a Nick Mattiello mail ballot exercise. It's also got to do with whether the notary public that was, by law, signing off on these things was in the right place, right time. So it's procedural. My guess is that you're not going to find any dirty fraud on the Speaker's behalf of the campaign, but it'll extend this drama out another week or so. But we'll see how it goes. In the meantime, locally, more Trump hand-wringing going on here. Yesterday, there was a rally at the State House where a couple of hundred folks turned up. We might bring some of those folks in here next week to hear what they have to say. No harumphing from you. No harumphing. It's important to hear what the community is saying about the president-elect. Whether I support him, you support him or not, he's our president, but we still have issues, questions. I think some of the nonsense that went on with the immigration program that Jorge Elorza, the Providence mayor, threw out last week was just it was a waste of breath and time. This one's a little different. The headline here, actually it's a press release sent out today. Mayor Elorza to announce Muslim American Advisory Board. He said this at the event today.
Heard a lot, not only from the president-elect, but also from the folks that surround him, that really worry us and frankly really frighten us. And so that's why it's more important than ever that we come together at the local level.
Everyone is afraid. It's unfortunate that I've lived in this country my entire life, and I've never felt afraid like I do now.
Look, we've had extensive conversation about Muslim ban rhetoric from Donald Trump in the election. The anxiety for the Muslim community in America is real. It's certainly present here in Rhode Island. That Jorge Elorza is jumping on this as a Providence issue because he's got no more jurisdiction is interesting. Whether he joins with Governor Raimondo on this, whether they work together or not, is still anybody's guess. But while I'm not really keen on Jorge Elorza and his overall political act, read Donald Trump, let's not discount the worries that Muslim Americans have that hopefully will dissipate as things even out with the Trump transition period. And in the meantime, it is presidential appointment city. Everyone's got an opinion, everybody's got a question, and there are people who are vying for positions. Here's the latest from CBS, and then we'll bring our expert on to discuss.
Are you in talks for any positions? One by one, more prominent Republicans made their way into the gold elevators at Trump Tower this morning as President-elect Donald Trump holds another day of meetings about staffing his administration. While no announcements have been made this week, senior Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway told MSNBC that Mr. Trump does not wish to pursue charges against Hillary Clinton for her use of a private email server while she was Secretary of State.
There's a tradition in American politics that after you win an election, you sort of put things behind you, and if that's the decision he reached, that's perfectly consistent with sort of a historical pattern.
Last night, the Trump transition team released video outlining plans for his first 100 days in office. Priorities include a withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and cutting regulations and fine-tuning the nation's visa program.
I will direct the Department of Labor to investigate all abuses of visa programs that undercut the American worker.
But there was no mention of a border wall or repealing Obamacare, two key campaign promises. Before heading to his Florida estate for the Thanksgiving holiday, Mr. Trump is also meeting with the New York Times. This morning, the president-elect tweeted that he canceled the meeting because the Times changed the conditions, something the paper denied. A Times spokeswoman says he'll meet with the publisher and editorial staff.
Okay, they had the meeting, he canceled the meeting, he put the meeting back on. Welcome. Good to see you again. Thank you. All our conversations have been pre-election, so before I get into it, your overall take is?
Well, my overall take is all my views are my own and do not represent the Department of Defense, the Navy, or any other carbon-based life form.
Double down on that. Now, your overall take is?
I'm as surprised as anyone else. However, I think Donald Trump is a clean slate. I don't know if he's going to be as ideological as people assume he's going to be. I am a bit concerned about his foreign policy, lack of experience. On the other hand, I hope he continues to select people with experience so that he can rely on them.
All right. We should, well, let's just jump right into it. Let's not get around with ourselves here. Why don't we post just the current list of appointees and kind of go down the list a little bit here and run it down. We don't have to tackle all these folks right off the bat, but let's start at the bottom with the chief strategist, Stephen Bannon. Thoughts on his politics, his Breitbart website, and his influence?
Well, there's been a lot of hyperbole surrounding Bannon and a lot of caricatures from the left criticizing Bannon. I think there are legitimate concerns about Bannon, but I also think that some of the criticism toward him has been factually incorrect and I think exaggerated. And people who are close to him don't consider him a racist. In fact, some of the articles pointed to with regard to anti-Semitism ended up being from a journalist, Howitz, criticizing individuals who were not pro-Israeli enough. So, and they use that as an example of anti-Semitism. So that's a bit of a stretch.
All right. Reince Priebus, chief of staff, again, I'm not sure what his foreign policy take, and I guess, again, my guest is most expert in that area, right? But he seems to be part of the body politic that can kind of keep a connection between that which is the establishment Republican, whatever is left of that,
right,
of that notion, and the rest, correct?
He has excellent relations with Congress. He is mainstream Republican Party apparatus. So as a result, he's going to be that bridge. He's going to have a lot of work to do, but he's going to be the bridge between the Trump administration and Congress. He is capable, he's smart, he's sensible, he's articulate. He's precisely the kind of person you want in that job.
All right, so there's a few more appointments here that we know about. National Security Advisor, former Rhode Island guy, Michael Flynn, and Mike Pompeo, who's interesting. Actually, he's actually very well respected, former military guy. He's on intelligence now. He's going to be a guy that doesn't blow my skirt up one way or the other. It seems to me that both of those appointments are okay. But Flynn has got some issues in terms of conflict of interest and also his whole disposition on Islam. So let's talk about Flynn for a second. You're worried about his rhetoric?
Well, I mean, I've had Flynn at the Naval War College come to my center for 3 years.
You know him?
Yes. I mean, I don't know him personally. I know him professionally.
Right.
And he's a very smart man. He's a legend in the intel community. Very, very good at tactics, very good at hunting high-value targets, and a good mind and a hard worker. So there are a lot of great things about General Flynn. The question is whether or not he has the temperament to hold that position, because National Security Advisor is simply the person who assembles all the information for the president and then gives him a briefing and then makes sure that the right people come in and out. Now the question is Flynn flexible enough to encourage alternative views to get to the president? That's the big question. It's not a question of whether or not he's smart or experienced. It's whether or not he's the right person for that job.
Well, it's interesting because we've heard a lot about him, and I actually have a buddy. We all have people, right? Former high-ranking military guy, now retired, who knows him personally, who tells me he's a good, solid man, all the things that you suggest. But there are a lot of folks who are saying, yeah, good, solid guy. We don't know this guy that acted out here in the last 6 months, really, in this Trump campaign, and really took on some political responsibility that may be extended past what he was known to be. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think a lot of it is culture-based. The military has a culture that is much more oriented toward blunt talk. And some, like Colin Powell, who are very polished, are able to translate into civilian leadership, while others maintain that kind of manner of speaking that is much more of a macho kind of thing. And Flynn tends to be that way. It doesn't mean that he's a hothead. It just simply means he hasn't learned to temper his language enough. Now, whether or not he will is a big question.
Are you concerned about his Islamic rhetoric?
I am concerned.
Suggesting that it's not a real religion, it's really a political movement?
I am concerned, again, with some of that rhetoric. And I'm most concerned with, if you have a laser focus toward Islamic extremism, there are other power vacuums in the world that we have to worry about. We have to worry about China's influence in the South China Sea. We have to worry about Russia and its aggressive acts toward Eastern Europe. There are a lot of other areas. Now, if you just focus on Islamic extremism and sacrifice others, then you may warp American foreign policy. Remember, the last 10 years has been an effort on the part of both Democratic and Republican administrations to move our focus away from the Middle East more toward Asia, because that's where all the emerging markets are.
Okay. When we come back, foreign policy run by the State Department, usually. We'll talk about what's going on there next. Stay with us.
Very thorough and in-depth discussion in the time we had, and appreciate the chance to speak with the President-elect.
Mind blower to me. Mind blower.
Politics makes strange bedfellows.
I mean, I understand about the pre and post, election dynamic. I've been following it all my life as a citizen, never mind as a broadcaster, analyst. But this one was not double down, triple down, quadruple down, quintuple down on how bad a guy Donald Trump is. I think Trump's got, on this level, much more thick skin, but he also likes having Romney come see him in Bedminster. I think that kind of settles the score right then and there. Romney, his love of country, right, maybe supersedes what he actually thinks about the Donald, but you're able to pinpoint what my concern is and break this down for me. What the rest of the world will think about this really tortured relationship that these two guys have had, and now they're aligned. Will they trust the relationship? Does the State Department become elevated if he makes this choice, or de-emphasized? What's your gut say?
Well, my gut says that Romney would be the establishment choice for Secretary of State. Very, sensible, moderate, pragmatic, well-respected, very smart. My gut says he's not going to be selected, that he's bringing Romney up for Secretary of State to demonstrate that he's looking for alternatives. I think he's going to be likely to choose...
Not Rudy.
It may be Rudy. It could be Bolton.
Bolton's a major league hawk, right?
Well, that's the irony. While Trump campaigned on a much more neutralist foreign policy, much less interventionist foreign policy, he is surrounding himself with true hawks. I mean, Mike Flynn is a hawk. You have potentially Mattis as Secretary of Defense, who's a tough old Marine, and he's a hawk. So if he's going to surround himself with hawks, it's going to be interesting to see how that foreign policy is going to veer away from what he campaigned on.
So you don't think Romney's the guy?
I would be surprised if Romney is the guy.
See, I don't know whether to be relieved or disappointed. I think Romney makes the world feel comfortable.
Yes. And he would be a good balance in the administration.
But balance, is he an influencer from that place?
Well, see, that's the thing. I think if he becomes Secretary of State, I don't think he's going to have the kind of influence you need to sway policy because his relationship is always going to be cold and remote with Trump. Whereas I think a Senator Corker from Tennessee, for example, who was a relatively early supporter of the Trump campaign, is a senator in good standing in the Senate. He would, I think, be much more effective. So I think if I were Trump, that's where I would be leaning. Because he doesn't have the bad relationship that he had with Romney. That said, Romney's a professional, a real patriot. He could probably get along well enough with Trump. It's whether or not Trump would respond to him.
Well, tell me, Mike Pence commented, many times this weekend on Romney. Here's what he said.
President-elect was very grateful that Governor Mitt Romney came in. They had a good meeting. It was a warm and a substantive exchange, and I know he's under active consideration to be the Secretary of State of the United States, along with some other very distinguished Americans.
He's running transition. He exudes that he wants Romney. I don't know what the truth is behind, but that's my interpretation. That, Reince Priebus becoming chief of staff, connecting the establishment Republicans that Pence has respect from and for, seems to me to be duplicated if Romney becomes the Secretary of State. So there's that thing in there, yes?
Well, predicting Trump decisions is, I'd rather go to Vegas because the odds are better for me there. I think it's a logical choice, but we have to get into Trump's head and say, who do I want to work with and who will make a good, loyal team member. Remember, loyalty is the most important thing to Trump. And whether or not he can expect loyalty from Romney, I can see him questioning that.
Sure. I think everybody can.
But everyone would love the balance. I mean, that would demonstrate a very mature, confident Trump who's willing to bring in alternative views and people who represent the establishment and still work with them.
Well, this will go to this whole concept that Donald Trump just wanted to get elected. After that, let the experts run the show. There's some people think, project that that's what we're going to have here. At some point, if Donald Trump starts to think he really knows what the heck he's doing, I think we're getting a little bit of dangerous territory, right? Because he has no experience in this whatsoever.
He's going to follow the CEO model, which is essentially what Reagan did. And that is hire really good people, surround yourself with smart people, and then you preside over them. And you put trust in your people to make the decisions. It's the exact opposite of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was Mr. Detail, and he micromanaged the entire administration. And then on the other hand, you had Reagan, who did exactly what the model you might have here with Trump, which is get good people, let them run. If they fail, remove them. If they succeed, push them onward. But give them broad rubric from which to follow.
The diversity aspect aside, because there isn't any right now yet, do you overall feel comfortable that there's a level of competency that has been chosen here so far?
Yes, so far. I am concerned that he's surrounding himself with too many military individuals. If you're going to have Flynn as National Security Advisor and then Mattis as SecDef, and you tend to want people with at least a lot of military experience, you may be prone to more groupthink. And that's always a problem in any administration. On the other hand, the caricature of military men as being more prone to using the military instrument is actually not correct. They know, they've seen the sacrifices on the battlefield, and many times they're less likely to go to war if the stakes aren't high enough. So it depends on how you want to view it. It could be good that he's surrounding himself with very experienced people. You also have to remember that Joe Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is a Marine. If Mattis takes SecDef, you're going to have real Marines in charge of the military establishment. That can be good, or it could be, again, too much groupthink.
All right, we'll see what the professor thinks the world is thinking of this whole process, including whether they're all signing on to their own Twitter accounts. We'll be right back. So the tweeting president-elect this behavior, is it something I just got to get used to and not worry about? Or is this something that on a foreign policy basis, especially when he's got to make very, very, very high-level security type decisions, will come back to bite him and bite us?
That's a great question. I would say I want a president who's disciplined, who understands the power of rhetoric and understands that rhetoric can get you in a lot of trouble. It can also constrain what you can and cannot do. Think of the Obama administration when it drew a red line on Assad for using chemical weapons, and then made themselves look like fools when they didn't enforce it. That's what happens when you become flippant with your information. Trump is really prone to that. He's also prone to narcissism and flattery. So I hope that we don't see a whole bunch of leaders who are flattering Trump on a regular basis in order to maybe get a better deal with the United States. I hope he's more mature than that.
Are you worried about the conflict of interest issues like I am, and that is, you know, the entire Trump empire, financial empire, conflicting with his, you know, running the show here? I mean, it doesn't seem to be moving toward a trust, and I don't even know if a trust is enough to separate him from perception problems, never mind reality problems, when it comes to, you know, working with foreign entities and all the investments and properties he has out there.
I don't think you can put real estate in a trust. You'd have to sell it. And since you'll be selling all your real estate at once.
The problem is when he sells it, the value goes down because the Trump label comes off of it.
And then giving it to your kids to run, which is a family business, you can understand that. But how do you say, you know, dad and son and daughters won't be talking about it? You can't. So there's going to be that natural thing. The problem is when you elect someone who's a multi-billionaire in a multinational corporation unto himself, then you just have to accept a certain degree of overlap. And the American people have made that decision knowing full well that he had global economic interests.
Do you see down the line, a year or two, the kind of thing that trips him up so badly he's an impeachment area because he just wasn't able to balance the two?
I think this is going to be the stormiest 4 years. This is going to make the Bill Clinton years look stable and quiet. The media is antithetical to everything that Trump stands for. The Democrats are salivating in wounded animals because of this election, so they'll be going after him. And then you have to blame the Republicans for the last 8 years for setting up the kind of, you know, environment in which this kind of behavior is the norm, not the exception.
We could go on all day, but tell me about the viewer who's watching this right now, who actually just has an innate anxiety that this guy is not going to keep us safe. What's your 30 seconds on that?
I'll make them feel better. Hillary Clinton was much more of an interventionist by nature. Remember, she got us into Libya. She has promoted a very robust and aggressive internationalist foreign policy, much more so than the Obama administration did while she was Secretary of State. Trump, on the other hand, has an instinct to say, if it is not in the national security interest directly, then I don't want to get involved. Now, that's going to cede some influence to the Russians and to others, but I think militarily will be much less prone to intervention unless he begins to be subverted by the people he put in his cabinet.
And overall terrorism security, 5 seconds on that?
It continues to be a problem, but I think that we have demonstrated in Homeland Security that we do a very, very good job.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Final word next. Coming up on the program tomorrow night, social mover Sherman Jones. If you've never met him on television, you'll make an appointment for this one, or you should. You'll enjoy it. See you on the Radio 3 tomorrow on WPRO. Get that turkey going.